Hello, my name's Lyndon. This is a short video just to help you with making sense of how you might use the School Refusal Assessment Scale as one of your tools in your approach to supporting attendance difficulties in school. We'd like to remind you first of all about some of the principles of assessment and what good assessment looks like. We'll touch briefly on the theoretical basis behind the School Refusal Assessment Scale and why it's one of the tools that we suggest you might find helpful. We'll then take you through how you might make use of the tool in practice, how you might interpret the results, and then what you might think about as your next steps. Before we start, just a quick note on language. School refusal is not a term that we often use nowadays. It's got negative connotations and it very much situates the attendance difficulty within the child. However, it's the name of the tool, so that's why we're talking about it today. In practice, when we're talking about non-attendance, we would have other ways of discussing it. We might talk about non-attendance, emotionally based absence, attendance difficulties. But when I use the word school refusal today, it's really just in relation to that being the name of the tool that we're discussing. Okay, so just to remind you very briefly, we'll be following the same principles of good assessment that we would with any kind of issue that comes our way when we're looking at supporting our young people. There's a really useful document that's been developed within the Education Service to support you with thinking about assessment tools, and I've taken these principles directly from there. So in terms of general guiding principles, assessment should be holistic. We should include the young person in the process and ensure that we're getting their views. The School Refusal Assessment Scale enables you to do that through the tool itself. It has a child report version, but you'll also be taking that young person's view into account in other ways. The assessment should be fit for purpose, so we're only going to be using the School Refusal Assessment Scale if it is related to the concerns that we're having. So we will have an unmet need or an assessment question around attendance that we've not been able to answer. It should be progressed in a strategic manner, so we're not going to go directly in there and start throwing every tool and questionnaire at young people. We want to be proportionate and ensure that it's the right time to come in and find out that information and that we don't have a way to find that out in a different, less intrusive way. Finally, assessment will be timely and constructive. So although we want to be careful that we're not being too intrusive and we want to try and take a holistic approach that is manageable for the young person, we also don't want to let problems fester and to grow without understanding fully what's going on. So getting in there quite quickly around attendance difficulties is something we would recommend because we know that over time they can become ingrained and we can get into vicious circles where attendance can be even more difficult to re-establish. So we want to find out early in our journey what some of the factors might be that are either causing or maintaining the attendance difficulties. And we hope that this tool would help you with managing that. So very briefly, the School Refusal Assessment Scale is based on a kind of functional approach to non-attendance. By that we mean that we're trying to understand the non-attendance behaviour in terms of how that works for that young person in terms of their emotional well-being or their learning needs. What is it that it's doing by avoiding school? How's that helping them? And broadly, you can think of the 4 factors in the School Refusal Assessment Scale in kind of 2 categories. There are push factors and there are pull factors. So we've got the push factors, the first 2 there, which are more related to the school environment, learning needs, academic pressures, social situations, etc. And the latter 2 you might think of as pull factors, so factors that relate to the home or community, relationships with significant people, anxiety about separating from caregivers, or engaging in activities or behaviours that are rewarding for that child when they're not in school. And that can be around kind of truancy behaviours where children are going and doing things that they enjoy more than being in school, but it can also be behaviours that they're undertaking within the home. So it could be around access to video games during the school day, could be one tangible reward, if you like, that a young person is engaging with rather than attending school. The factors are not mutually exclusive, so quite often there's more than one thing going on. And you can imagine that a child might stay away from school due to some of the push factors, something that's making them a little bit anxious in the school day. But then over time, maybe their relationship and being close to their parent becomes very important for them in managing some of that anxiety. So we might also get some separation anxieties creeping in and making the picture more complicated. Similarly, if they're off school for a period of time, they might get used to the routines of being at home and the comforts of being at home and some of the things that they get to do when they're there. So factor 4, that kind of tangible reward, could become more important for them, even if it's not the reason that the non-attendance started in the first place. As I say, they're often interrelated, often coexisting, and really the purpose of the school refusal assessment scale is to get a rounded understanding of all those factors, how they're impacting upon the child, so that we can respond holistically to their needs. Okay, so if you're using this scale, you'll already be some way down the road to working with that young person and trying to understand what's going on for them. You'll have noticed a drop in their attendance, probably quite a significant drop by the time you get to using this, or maybe a sudden change. You'll have already used some of the tools that are available to you through the Stage Intervention Framework for Attendance. We expect you would have used the CCAT, the School Experience Contextual Assessment tool, which there is information on separately from this video. Before you get started, just a little note of caution. Some of the research around the School Refusal Assessment Scale suggests that it might be slightly less suitable for children who are autistic. It's not to say it can't be used, but just interpret with caution and make sure that you're considering and thinking about whether all of the factors are most relevant. One of the reasons that seems to be the case is that it doesn't necessarily speak to the neurodiverse experience in terms of school environments. So you might want to use other tools to think about some of those environmental factors and consider the needs of your neurodiverse learners. There's a reference there that I'd encourage you to have a wee look at as well that gives a bit more information about how you can be a bit cautious about using the school refusal assessment scale with this group. Having said that, it still might be quite functional for you. The research doesn't say don't use it just says use it with a bit of caution. So before you get started with the school refusal assessment scale, you would be reviewing what your existing information tells you about the situation. You'll know what it is that you're looking for from the school refusal assessment scale. You will have outstanding questions that you're trying to answer about the function of those attendance difficulties. We know that asking some of the questions within school refusal assessment scale or introducing it with parents or caregivers can be a little bit tricky. We're asking some quite sensitive questions. Some parents they're already feeling quite anxious and finding the situation difficult, and it can feel that it could come across as judgmental. We might worry that it might come across as judgmental when we're asking about some of the home factors that are keeping non-attendance going. So we want to get them on the same team as us. We want to be thinking about the fact that you're trying to establish the reasons for non-attendance together so that you can work on it together. It's not about us against them. So you might want to have a little bit of a script. We've suggested one here. You could write your own one. And it's coming back to the research evidence and being really factual about it. So we could say something like, we know that when children are having difficulty attending school regularly, that there are often lots of different factors impacting upon them. We know that when children's needs are not well understood, that interventions to support school attendance are often unsuccessful, sadly. So it's important that we ask questions about both home and the school and community, home and school, sorry, and community factors to make sure that we're not missing anything important. This information will add to what we know already to help us identify the most appropriate solutions. And that is very much couched in the research evidence. We know that holistic approaches are most successful with school non-attendance. We know it's very rarely one factor. And quite often, anecdotally, I would say schools understand really, really well some of the things that are difficult for that young person in school. And they've maybe tried lots of adaptations in that environment, but it can be less clear what's happening at the other end and how non-attendance is being reinforced unintentionally outside of the school setting. It's suitable for school-aged children, so it's not a standardised tool. You're not comparing them against their age group. It's about them as an individual and ranking the strength of those different factors that we mentioned earlier in terms of their ability to explain that child's non-attendance or difficulties with attendance. You can fill it in electronically as a fillable PDF and save it, or print to PDF to save the answers. You could print it out on paper and sit down with a parent or a young person and do it. You could do it over the phone with them. You could do it on Teams. just really determine what's going to work best for them. And as I say, having that script to introduce it can be really, really helpful. As I said earlier, there's a parent version and there's a child version. They ask very similar questions, just worded appropriately to whether they're in the parent or the child role. As I say, if you're administering it, think about a script or an introduction. Ensure that the parent or the child knows that there are no right or wrong answers, encouraging them to answer all the questions, even if it feels a bit uncertain or if it seems a bit obvious. And ideally get both, get the parent or caregiver and the child's perspectives, because it gives you that greater triangulation of data and insight sometimes into their differences of view. So it could be at times that parents feel that it's very much school factors. Young people can then report, actually, it's about, I don't want to be away from mum, for example. Or sometimes that they might be very well aligned, and that gives you good information too. A wee note on some of the other language when I was reviewing the scale in preparation for putting this video together. Some of the language makes some assumptions. So the parent response form uses words like spouse when perhaps it would have been better saying partner. And pronouns are kind of assumed as well. So just be a little bit cautious and think about the family makeup when you're administering it. And if there are any wee issues with language you might want to highlight if that's going to be a sensitivity for that family. Okay, so I've just taken a little screenshot from the bottom of the questionnaire. So you'll see the items, the parent or the child ranks them in relation to how well it describes them. It's a kind of 6-point scale. You are then able to use the scoring guide. So you just take the response from each of the questions, transcribe it down into the bottom. You can see the numbers of the questions there, add them up, and it's just simple adding. There's no kind of calculations or tables to look at. And you've got 4 columns there, so you take the total score for each of those columns. Those columns relate to those 4 factors we mentioned earlier, and then you average them. So you divide each of the total scores by 6 to give you an average score. And that will then show you the relative ranking or strength of explanation for each of the factors in relation to that young person. And as a reminder, those are the 4 factors. You can pause the video for a moment to read it, that relate to each of those columns. Here's an example here of one that's been scored up. So all of the kind of numbers have been transcribed down here into the bottom of the questionnaire. This is just for one person's questionnaire, so you might have 2 sets of these if you've got a child and a parent version. And you can see we've got the total added up here. So we're already seeing kind of what the pattern is, but we've just got a couple more recalculations to do. So you can see what I've done there is that I've then divided each of these totals by 6 to get our mean score or average score for each factor. And then the highest number becomes our most significant factor. So the first factor that we're talking about in this young person is factor 3, which would relate to separation anxiety. And you can see that's quite a bit higher than the rest. There's not an awful lot to choose between the rest. They're all between kind of 1.5 and 2 on average. So this seems to be the strongest factor for them. In other young people, it could be that it's a little bit more mixed, or you might have 2 very strong factors, some that are not at all. So it really depends on the circumstances, but for this one, certainly that's what's coming out strongly. And as I mentioned earlier, if it's the case that you're seeing this in the child's version, but on the adult's version, you're seeing maybe factor 1 or 2 as being the most significant. That maybe tells you something that needs a bit more exploration. Okay, as I said, we've ordered the 4 factors, and for this young person, it's to receive attention from a parent or significant other, or a need to be with a significant person. It can be related to separation anxiety. So what do you do next? So we've talked a lot about why you might use it, how you might use it. What do you do once you've got that information? How's it going to help you? So as I said, you might want to compare the 2 if you've got the parent or caregiver and the child. Look for contrasts, look for similarity. You might want to look at it in relation to the other assessments that you have. What else might you need to explore further? Any of the interventions you already have, does it indicate you need to adapt or consider changes to those? If separation anxiety is a concern, why is that a concern for that young person? Is there something we need to understand about their situation, or is there kind of an insecurity around that child's belief that that caregiver is going to be there, and do we need to support them from that point of view and support them to understand that their caregiver is a constant and is available to them when they're away. So we'll talk about that in a wee moment. Have a feedback or discussion with the parents, caregivers, and the young person. Get some qualitative information. How was that answering those questions? Did it make them think of anything else? Did it highlight anything that was a bit of a difficult spot for them? Was there anything that didn't make sense? So talk around the questionnaire too. That can give you some really valuable information. And what can caregivers or family do? So we don't want to just place all the responsibility on you in school. So if factor 4 is a big issue, what is it that the family can be doing to support that and to ensure that there's not that tangible reward associated with non-attendance? And again, it's about getting on board with the family so that you're all on the same team and trying to work towards the same goal. Okay. So depending on what it is that comes out from your school refusal assessment scale, you might want to think about some different interventions. Separately from this video, you'll see we've got our interventions guide, which we will link to. And I guess what we're asking you to think about is linking your interventions to this 4-factor model. So with factors 1 and 2, they're both related to school factors, either kind of social factors, environmental factors, or factors to do with learning or assessment environments. So have a think about your existing information, your circle tools, the CCAT, what do you know about the physical environment and how that meets the needs of the young person? How is their day structured? What are the strategies in class? Do the teachers in a secondary school, does everybody understand well what that young person needs? Does that young person know what the teachers know about them? Because sometimes that's really important to get the young person very familiar with what teachers know and how teachers have been asked to support them. One of the factors that's really common and comes up in the CCAT is that anxiety about being put on the spot and being asked when they don't know the answer. So the young person knowing that's not going to happen is really important. Are there any factors around learning needs that might need exploration? So particularly factor 2, is there anything about that young person's literacy or their understanding in classes that is making things more difficult and making them avoid the classroom environment? Are there any exceptions, so either in secondary or in primary across the week? Are there any times or areas or activities that seem to work better and don't evoke that anxiety for the young person? What does that tell you about them? Are there any further assessments that are required? Do we need to look at our kind of support for learning colleagues if there's perhaps a literacy issue? What do we know about that child's social relationships? Is there anything that we can do to support them with peer relationships? Because that, again, can be another factor within the kind of school factors, those push factors in 1 and 2. Factor 3, we've touched on briefly in our example. We might need to explore some further reasons for that separation anxiety. Is it secondary to some of those other factors, or is it the primary factor? Could there be caring responsibilities? So for example, a young person that I worked with in previous years had real and significant anxieties about being away from a significant person at home because they had a medical condition, which meant that they could be at risk of collapse. The adult at home had a community alarm, but it didn't always work. So there was a real kind of push or a pull for that young person to be in the home environment to keep their adult safe. So those are the sorts of things that we need to understand, whether it's more of an emotional difficulty for them, or is it actually a practical or physical issue that needs a bit of support? And are there other services that are needing to be involved? Finally, factor 4, home or community factors. Is this something that's happening in the home? Can parents or caregivers limit access to things like video games, Wi-Fi, etc.? Could you work with parents to make sure that that young person is accessing their preferred activities in a way that's compatible with school attendance? Is there a way of prioritising their interests that supports them to be in school? It could be that could be put in place as part of an incentive or reward system, for example, if that was something that was really important to them. Although we always say if a young person is very anxious about attending school, it's not a reason to stop them from going to social activities outside of the school day. We do want to encourage those social and peer links to be maintained while the child's not in school, because if we take those away, it can exacerbate any anxieties or difficulties that that young person might be having. So those are just some of the things to think about. And what we'd encourage you to do is see our intervention guide, which breaks down some of the different ways that you might want to take this forward at different levels of intervention and in relation to those different factors. So please do go and explore that. And if you have any questions about the use of the tool, please contact your Link educational psychologist or the generic educational psychology address. Okay, thank you.